All right, hopefully that's working. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Lisa, for that introduction. Yeah, I'm Sam Brookfield. I'm a researcher at the University of Queensland. I'd like to start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm speaking to you from today, which is the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Today, I'm talking to you about ethnographic research that I conducted with people experiencing methamphetamine-related harm, and some of the theoretical insights that can be derived from it, working ultimately towards a model of what I'm calling extended recovery. And we're going to sort of start in the middle with one of the participants, which is Jane. So it was September 2018, and I'd gone to visit Jane at her home north of Brisbane. And I visited her home a few times, and we were getting to know each other pretty well through the course of the research. And the rain was slowly getting heavier. Jane was furiously washing dishes, and I helped to dry them with an already sodden tea towel. And Jane and her partner Ian had started using methamphetamine again frequently, and their relationship was straining under the weight of the disorder and the conflict that came with that kind of drug use, alongside the responsibility of caring for their children. Jane was really angry about Ian's behavior, and she felt like they were trapped in this pattern that they couldn't escape. And she was being really hard on herself. At one point, as soap suds flew into the air, she said, "It's how you see yourself. Maybe that's what you think you deserve because I've been a crap mum, or I think maybe that's all I'm worth. That's all I deserve as well." What I could see over the months that I spent with Jane and with Ian as the couple moved in and out of drug use, engaging variously with this research project, with me, with support services, with child safety, and with family members, Jane struggled with not just her own drug use or cravings or triggers, but this wider social context that decided how she was seen, and whether she felt like she was accepted, whether she could be allowed into the realm of acceptable people, women or mothers. So the problem of addiction or harmful drug use, it was in part created and compounded by the social context it occurred in, and the structural factors that determined what services she could access, what social support she had, and thereby how severe the harms were that she experienced. So recovery, which she talked about often, it wasn't just a clinical pathway towards abstinence, but a more multidimensional process of trying to become more socially acceptable, more human. This phrase was Jane's description of how she and Ian were feeling after not using for the following 2 weeks when I went back. Commenting on how different their lives were that short time later, Jane said that, yes, we're a bit more human now. Now, in one way, this is sort of a throwaway phrase that any of us might use, but it really got me thinking, like, what do we mean when we say we're becoming more human? Obviously, this definition changes over time. In our current era, I think it arguably describes someone who's moderate, responsible, autonomous, and productive. Everything that Jane thought she wasn't when they were using drugs. So Jane and Ian's cycles of drug use and abstinence, of losing and regaining their status as human in their own eyes, occurred in the context of contemporary Australia, where healthcare is increasingly structured around neoliberal paternalism and responsibilization. Frameworks that reinforce this vision of human as autonomous, independent, a rational, responsible consumer, a template that's implicit in neoliberal policy, in public health messaging. And at a deeper level, it's reflective of concepts of the individual that are fundamental to Western philosophy. By demonstrating these qualities, by engaging with traditional addiction recovery, it can bring social capital as well as clinical and political legitimacy to people that experience stigma and marginalization, people that may feel their humanity threatened. And so through my analysis, I'm arguing that this threat places an unnecessary burden on people that are already suffering with drug-related harm, and that if we can rethink how we have problematized addiction and update and expand our ideas of the human, of health, of illness, and of recovery, we can erode this binary distinction between rational, responsible citizens and compulsive drug users increase the effectiveness of policy and interventions for drug-related harm, and reduce this suffering. So I would argue that one of our problems when we're going into this area is that we still don't have very good or widely accepted definitions of what addiction really is. We have definitions that work well enough, but it's more of a case of we know it when we see it, rather than being able to say accurately what is going on. And a lot of this boils down to a widely discussed theoretical issue within drug use literature and research, which impacts how drug use is tackled in treatment, in a legal sense, at a policy level, and a political level. And that is the lack of reconciliation between two key concepts. One, that addiction occurs when an individual loses control over their behavior. And two, that addiction can only be resolved when that individual chooses to regain control. Darren Weinberg, who's a sociologist, refers to this as the missing core of addiction science and research. And I would argue that this confusion doesn't come about because addiction itself is anything particularly mysterious, but it arises from viewing addiction within this neoliberal humanist perspective, which can't account for how non-rational and how not in control we all really are, without even needing to focus on people using drugs. It's a symptom of our overly optimistic Enlightenment era vision of what the individuated human is capable of. And so the question of whether people experiencing drug-related harm require external support or external control, or sort of more crudely, treatment versus punishment, this has been at the heart of the debate about drugs for the last 100 years. And I argue that a post-humanist framework can provide a path out of this confusion. Now, post-humanism can mean various different things, and it has a kind of science fiction ring to it. But I'm using post-humanism here to describe a school of thought, a way of viewing the everyday world around us that attempts to move beyond some of the basic ideas of traditional humanism. And it's been prompted by various scientific discoveries that cause us to question the traditionally defined limits of a human or of a person. Things like the ways we're more integrated with technology, but also blurred lines between, say, the human self and the ocean of microorganisms that are also part of the human body, or the ways that groups of people, families, or political parties act as units and organisms in themselves. So a post-humanist approach questions and disrupts some of the common contentions of humanism, such as that humanity is made up of autonomous, conscious, discrete individuals, and also the implications that sometimes follow from this, including that humans represent some kind of center or pinnacle of evolution, are always in procession towards a bigger and better future, and hold a natural authority over everything that happens in our environment. Posthumanism alternatively views the individual human as primarily a nexus of contingent and dynamic relations, embedded and extended through a socio-material environment. We're a bundle of relations rather than an individual node or unit. Another way of saying this is that the world is not here for our benefit, and there is no higher, anterior, immaterial self to receive that benefit anyway. Now, this is not addiction specific. These are observations or positions that can apply across all of human behavior and experience, but the connection to addiction, the value of applying this to addiction, is that addictive behaviors arguably make this perspective unavoidable. It's where sort of the rubber of our illusions meets the road. The rest of the time we can debate whether there is a self that is or not in control of something, but the indeterminacy of addiction, where people so acutely experience control and the loss of control, it causes all the confusion in our attempts to define addiction. And so it can therefore lead to a post-humanist conclusion about how best to understand ourselves. These are just a couple of other quotes that illustrate this idea, also acknowledging, these aren't radically new ideas either. In a way, they're very, very old ideas. This is a quote from Clifford Geertz, one of the founders of ethnographic research, saying that the Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, more or less integrated, motivational and cognitive universe, a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action, is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea in the context of the world's cultures. And this is a quote from Richard Davenport Hines in his book about the history of drug use. Habitual users of narcotics seldom fit into the bourgeois sense of human identity as a serious business, stable, abiding, and continuous, requiring the assertion of one true cohesive inner self as proof of health and good citizenry. People using drugs will often fall outside of this model, and that is a big part of why they can be seen and treated as such a problem. So that's the theoretical basis for the model of extended recovery, which challenges how the problem of addiction is usually represented as either a failure of individual will or a failure of policy and systems. And the argument here is that by examining people's experiences closely through something like ethnography, you can show how the process of addiction doesn't strictly conform to either of these frameworks. Human life is more complex than both these paradigms would imply, which is to say that phenomena is emergent. It's resulting from a wide array of factors rather than a linear or a rational process. At the same time, extended recovery, it's not intended to be a reinvention of the wheel. We're not starting from scratch in terms of what to do about harmful drug use. There's plenty of interventions and policies that have a really positive impact. This is proposed instead as sort of a new terminology, theoretical framing that can draw together different ideas that are out there into a theoretically coherent approach. So it's more like an attempt to rethink the axle upon which the wheel of recovery turns and try to resolve some of this theoretical confusion that causes so much unnecessary and sort of endless debate about harmful drug use. It's saying that if we can straighten out the ideas at the basis of all of our interventions, then we can make them more effective. And so with this project, I'm aiming to discover how a posthumanist theoretical landscape could better serve the humans currently suffering under these more neoliberal ideals of the responsible, rational, but also atomized and lone citizen. So in this research project, I focused in on methamphetamine use, or people using methamphetamine, and that is for a variety of reasons. Methamphetamine-related harm is a significant and sort of escalating public health issue, and particularly in Australia. It's continued to increase over the last decade, and especially in Queensland, where there's like the significant statistic there that between 2009 and 2014, we had a 17-fold increase in methamphetamine-related hospital presentations. We've continued to see an increase in frequency of use, in side effects such as psychosis, in injecting. Australasia has the highest rate of amphetamine dependence in the world currently. And meanwhile, the most evidence-based intervention we have is long-term abstinence-focused residential rehabilitation. And when we do study that for people using methamphetamine, for long-term, if we do long-term follow-up, still around 90% of people will return to their previous pattern of use. So people are, at the very least, needing multiple episodes of care and treatment. And so we clearly need to be doing something different in the way we reduce these harms and the way we focus our treatment approaches. And so just a quick note on ethnography, for anyone who's not familiar with it, that was the research method I used for this project. In some ways, ethnography is it's a fairly simple research method, or deceptively simple, in terms of it's based around participant observation. The idea is to observe people performing behaviors in their natural environment, to go out into the world and basically try to understand the real world as it's happening out there without imposing on it in sort of an experimental form. So for this, I used participant observation and semi-structured interviews with each participant. Each participant gave 3 interviews over a 6-month period. And then I would do observation in between, which was around things focused on their recovery. So it'd be things like medical appointments, counselling appointments, going to see parole officers, also going to see their family members and just living their everyday life. So you can kind of think of it, as it says here, like a form of sociological stalking. It's a form of stalking. It's like stalking somebody with their permission. That's one way you can think about it. And I particularly tried to do this form of critical ethnography, where rather than just observing and describing the world as we see it, we also try to understand and critique the ideas and the power structures that are giving rise to that world. So critiquing the bodies of knowledge and the systems of power that are at play that give rise to what it is that we're observing. And this is just a brief overview of the participants. We won't be able to go through all of them today. We had 12 participants, as you can see, mostly in their 30s and 40s. Most had most had been introduced as young adults, and so had quite long durations of methamphetamine use. And during that 6 months, some of them had long-term abstinence with periods of use, some reduced their use, some continued to use methamphetamine frequently throughout. And we had a couple that were lost to follow up. And one of the things that you get through something like this sort of qualitative approach is sort of the diversity of people's understandings and experiences. So with all this talk about recovery, we could see that different participants had different ideas of what recovery could mean. As Carl said, even though I've been using every couple of weeks, I still feel like and constantly feel like I'm in recovery. Ian was more resistant to the whole idea. He said, I believe people have got their opinions. It's their opinion. Get on with it. I'm willing to listen to much of it. But once you start dictating to someone, or someone's dictating to me what I should be doing, how I should be doing, it's really going to get my goat up and start getting really nasty. And then Simon, who was very much focused on being abstinent and wanted to stop using altogether, he said, I believe that recovery is the wrong word in relation to me. I think what's happening to me is I've got a new sense of belonging somewhere else. And maybe I think it's what has been missing. That's what's been driving my behavior. And so we don't have time to go through everybody. So what I'm going to do is go through two key case studies that can help illustrate the ideas I'm talking about. And the first one we're going to go through is Simon there. So Simon was in his mid-50s and had worked mostly in accountancy positions, both in Australia and overseas. He came out as gay later in life and felt that he had not been able to be himself before this. He'd been in a heterosexual marriage for some years, and then his most significant partner since then was a younger man who became abusive and violent towards him. Simon's first methamphetamine use was in the context of this relationship in response to his experiences of abuse and also exposure to the drug. After the relationship ended, Simon moved to work overseas, and he would travel frequently to Southeast Asia, where he was more comfortable expressing his sexuality. Overseas, Simon started using methamphetamine more frequently, particularly in sexual contexts where drug use and sociality became inextricably entwined. After about a year, his mental health deteriorated, and he was able to return to his family in Australia, who supported him in managing his drug use. He continued using methamphetamine intermittently after this time. During the course of this project, Simon cycled between periods of drug use and abstinence several times. He lost his job as an accountant for a small business. He struggled to find work and new accommodation. When he couldn't find a place to rent, some close friends allowed him to stay with them for some weeks. With the kind of white-collar work he had access to, he also had enough savings to carry him through this period in combination with Social Security payments. He had a university education, no criminal record. But partly due to the social status of his family and the environment he was raised in, which was a protective factor that reduced his barriers to future employment. He accessed free weekly counselling intermittently throughout the project, and he also underwent a 5-day outpatient detox process. He also started volunteering at a local charity, but he was still struggling to make the kinds of social connections there that he always so adamantly desired. His isolation contributed to his ongoing drug use, his low self-esteem. Commenting to his counselor one day, he said that if I was okay, that I would have friends and a partner. And he would say that Christmas was his worst day of the year. In one interview, he said, And this is probably the core of my problem. My personal problem is that I don't have many activities. And if I sit at home by myself, I start to feel lonely. And then eventually I get depressed about that because I don't want to end up alone. And then that tends to be my trigger in using. So my trigger is not money, which it was for some other participants. It's to get away from that feeling. Towards the end of the project, a friend recommended he apply for a job working in public transport. He was successful after an extensive and stringent application process. Working there, Simon enjoyed having colleagues to work with more closely than at his other jobs, and he felt that this job gave him that sense of belonging that had always been missing. He was still persistently concerned, however, about his new friends learning about his history of drug use, in case they just have that picture of someone who lies in the gutters or in a back lane somewhere, and that's all they do. They're dirty and diseased. He also attended a new recovery service that prescribed him modafinil, which is a psychostimulant sometimes used as a partial replacement therapy. And he said this significantly reduced his cravings. At our last interview, he had been abstinent for 7 weeks, and he intended not to use again. During that interview, I asked how things had changed for him during this period. And he said, I'd say I'm almost a different person. I said, what's the difference? He said, because I can see a future, right? And I want that. I can see a future that I want, whereas back at the start of the year, I didn't really see a future. So by contrast with earlier times in his life, Simon was now open about his sexuality and his personal relationships, and had also experienced some social and romantic relationships that were not abusive or involving drug use. He had obtained employment that gave him a greater sense of meaning and connection. He'd been protected from some drug-related harms by his financial situation, capacity to earn money or to gain new employment, and also the reliability of his family and social network. So if Simon continued to be abstinent from methamphetamine to progress further into his recovery, then this can be seen, it's more than a personal decision made at one turning point in his life. His drug use was initiated, maintained, and reduced through relationships and the pursuit of connection with those around him. Whether familial, social, collegial, romantic, or sexual. Simon's recovery can therefore be seen as an emergent effect of his own agency, happenstance, cultural context, material resources, service availability, pharmaceutical intervention, and then also the ways that homophobia, class, and other structural factors could both promote and restrict his access to social capital, his access to financial resources, his access to recovery options. So his recovery occurred within his own set of capacities and intentions, but was still supported, shaped, and inhibited by this very wide array of external factors. A second case study is Kim. So Kim was a woman in her mid-30s whose parents had arrived in Australia as refugees from Vietnam when she was a child. As a teenager, Kim started truanting from school and stealing from shopping centres to have the same consumer products her friends had. She described her parents as strict and distant, and her father struggled with a gambling habit. When she was 15, her father left, and Kim called this the time when everything fell apart. As she put it, she ran away from home and lived with her partner for the next 7 years, who was intermittently violent towards her. In this context, she started smoking heroin, moving later to smoking and injecting methamphetamine. She supported herself by working various low-level office jobs. However, after her relationship ended, she began stealing more from designer clothing stores to support her drug use. She had been imprisoned 8 times. I attended some of her court hearings where the judge would listen to her history with domestic violence and drug use, but then comment that Kim's last drug-related conviction had been some years ago, sort of implying that the evidence of the impact of drug use on her life was restricted only to her court appearances. Her lawyer would argue that support and recovery would help resolve her criminal behavior, but the judge was very preoccupied with what he called her appalling criminal record. Despite this, she remained out on parole during the fieldwork. Kim's mother had custody of her only child, which was a daughter born a couple of years previously, with whom she had supervised visitation through child safety. The child had been taken by child safety after Kim had told them that the father had sexually assaulted her, causing them to investigate their living situation. If she did not regain custody within the next 12 months by providing clean urine samples, attending visitation, and undergoing mandated counselling, she would be unable to regain custody of her child. At the start of the project, Kim said she'd been using methamphetamine every day for 5 months. And the first interview was conducted at an inpatient withdrawal unit that she had been admitted to. Her social circle was small and usually comprised only other people using drugs. So drug use for Kim meant existing in what felt to her like another world. Rather than a process governed by willpower or hedonism within herself, it was this material and social landscape full of drama and relationships. As she says, it's nerve-wracking, actually. It's quite scary. It's daunting to think that anyone could do that to you, meaning assault her. And to think that the game is so dangerous. That's what I call it, being in the game. It's just a different world, being in the drug world. It's things you've never seen or experienced before. Putrid people do putrid things towards you. After completing her inpatient admission, I drove her to a long-term residential rehab centre, and she stayed there for about 5 weeks, but then was asked to leave after being caught smoking cigarettes on the premises, which was not allowed. During the project, she continued to use pretty frequently, at one point losing her visitation rights with her daughter and having multiple court appearances for previous stealing offences. So Kim would describe drug use as this controlling force in her life that made her own behaviour confusing to her. The word drug, as she says, that's what it means to me: baffling, conniving, manipulating, thieving, stealing. It's so cunning, like baffling, powerful, really powerful. At the end of the project, she had reduced her use and had been absent for about 3 weeks. Her partner was going through drug court and had not used for over 7 weeks. She planned to stop using long-term to regain custody of her daughter, and she felt that she'd learned a lot from her relatively short stay in residential rehabilitation. She was hoping to find a centre she could stay at with her daughter, and she repeated frequently how much better it would be for her to engage in recovery with her daughter close by. The consequences and the frequency of Kim's drug use had slowly decreased during the period of data collection, with Kim considering herself to be in recovery throughout this time. Kim had a complex understanding of her own agency and personal responsibility. In her second interview, she said, "I think I'd be using every day. I'd still be injecting, to be honest, if I didn't have my daughter. I think I'd still be a junkie. A junkie would go to any extent to get their drugs, and I mean any. That's when I was stealing to get my drugs, to support my habit. The drug controls them then." So she acknowledged that the reason for her not using was an external incentive that she couldn't control, but also that when someone is what she called a junkie, they are out of control. But then she would also say, "I take all responsibility for my actions. I don't think of the consequences which go for my actions, and that's when I get in trouble for it, like breaking the law or going to jail. That's what I get for committing those crimes." So Kim's perspective on her own behavior is consistent with legal understandings of criminal responsibility, but conflicts with drug use theory that requires loss of control and some aspects of therapeutic recovery discourse that views those behaviors as part of sort of a separate self. Many participants seem to inhabit this conflicted space where they reported experiencing a lack of control, but they did not link this to a lack of personal responsibility. So Kim's prolonged abstinence by the end of the project, it arose from her own mental state and motivation to regain custody of her daughter, from the support of her mother in caring for her daughter, the support of her partner and the drug court process that he was involved in, her successful presentation for court appearances, partly due to her ready access to transport via me during this time, decisions by judges not to send her back to prison, the invasive drug testing requirements of child safety, some changes in her social network that meant methamphetamine was still accessible but less present. And so without implying any reduced responsibility or credit on Kim's behalf, it can be seen that if we focus only on pathologized aspects of Kim's own psychology or neurobiology, then we're going to be dealing with only one small part of how this kind of change occurs, and only one component of a recovery process that extends far beyond her own body or mind. The experiences of Simon and Kim can demonstrate how many factors can influence drug use and recovery, making it harder to see recovery as a process occurring within an individual person, but more as something distributed through the context in which it occurs. Both Simon and Kim underwent trajectories of drug use and recovery that emerged from a wide range of capacities and vulnerabilities and opportunities. So what does this theoretical insight mean for drug use, services, and policy? I would argue that having this broader and sort of deeper conception of recovery requires first a similarly expanded understanding of disease as applied to addiction. While Simon didn't use this language, he also associated drug use with being dirty and stigmatized. Kim would say that she felt yes and no when it came to calling addiction a disease, because she also believed that one day it would not be in her life, and therefore it was more like life experience. Meanwhile, for both of them, there were long-term and progressive impacts on their mental and physical health that they frequently accessed health services to manage. Like other health issues, harmful drug use incorporates measurable pathophysiology. It's also shaped by what we think of as the agency of an individual, the individual's choices, whilst also being overrepresented in populations that are subject to various structural factors. So, which is to say that harmful drug use shows up very much like other chronic health conditions. And this is something covered in one of the publications coming from this research, where we argue for an approach that can support people to be living with harmful drug use, similar to how people are increasingly supported to live with things like heart disease or depression. Then the use of disease terminology obviously has a complex and fraught history in the context of drug use that we have to acknowledge. It's been called a disease of the brain, disease of the will, a social disease. And this question of definition, again, has well-established clinical, social, policy consequences. Because medicalizing something like that and calling it a disease, it restricts agency in a way that serves an essential socio-political purpose, as they say here, by making people who use drugs worthy recipients of compassion and treatment. Meanwhile, if we don't do this, if we treat drug use as categorically different to other chronic health issues, this can also be marginalizing. We can exclude this population from the social and practical resources that we would allocate to managing other health issues. If addiction is somehow completely different to other chronic health issues, then we risk enshrining it as a primarily disembodied and psychological and therefore also criminalized sort of characteristic. So part of what I'd argue for is that disease terminology can still address the health impacts of harmful drug use, but a reductionist, like a brain disease paradigm, is obviously insufficient for explaining the full range of harmful drug-related behaviors. So if harmful drug use is not a disease of the brain, then what is it a disease of? From a posthumanist perspective, we would say it's a disease of the network within and around the individual. The diseased state arises from this much broader conception of what people are and how their behavior emerges. It's not an individual factor or a structural factor, it's both and. And so I would argue there's a place for us to reclaim and redefine the terminology of disease, and in a way that can still be useful for harmful drug use. And just going a bit further on the posthumanism aspect, this is another quote from Darren Weinberg, who's done a lot of work applying posthumanism to drug use. And he says, as a posthumanist, I regard diseases as not merely a pathological biological mechanism, but more generally patterns of harmful bodily articulation. That is, patterns of bodily articulation with which we cannot or do not want to identify ourselves precisely because they afflict or endanger those articulations with which we do self-identify. And if we're clear that this is what is meant by disease, then I can see no reason to deny and every reason to affirm that an addiction might be just such a thing. Extended recovery also draws on the language of extended health, which is a field of thought and research. It's building on convergent evidence from a lot of different areas, basically arguing for an increased focus on the similarities and symbiosis between human, animal, and ecological health. With their proposal of extended health by Morrow and Skolberg, which is one of the main papers on it, they talk about occupying the important middle ground between traditional models of health focused on the individual and the global vision of One Health that can be so broad it's hard to apply to specific things. So again, this is another way of talking about finding a way of integrating these two ways of seeing the world as individual factors or structural factors. So when we're talking about extended recovery, it's a form of recovery not necessarily extended in time, but in space. Viewing recovery as a process emerging from a thick web of intertangled forces, the way an individual tree can arise from a vast, complex root structure. As was the case for Kim and Simon, recovery and drug use was thickly entangled through relationships with many different people. Some of this is implicit in another statement from Simon when he paused during one interview and then said, "I'm sorry, I'm just thinking a lot in my head." Of course, where else would you think? Extended recovery could be seen as an answer to this question. Our thoughts are produced and therefore are happening far beyond our own heads. And we need to start thinking about human thought, behavior, and health more explicitly in this way. So there's 4 initial recommendations that could be derived from an extended recovery model that can address these theoretical and practical aspects of harmful drug use. First recommendation is for a primarily theoretical change towards approaching harmful drug use as a multi-dimensional disease, rather than only a product of structural forces or individual pathology. This multi-dimensional approach could be supported by a more informed and nuanced concept of agency, not as a quality of individuals, but as a conventional term for certain emergent effects that we've usually ascribed to the will of individuals, but are really enacted and experienced as these sort of complex shifting assemblages. This model could help diffuse the constant debate around choice and personal responsibility of people who use drugs and prevent moralistic or punitive understandings of drug use from shaping our policy or our funding decisions. I think the concepts of extended recovery could help create the ideological space for a wider conversation about the social determinants of drug use, but also other physical and psychological diagnoses, how addiction is a typical case of ill health rather than an unusual instance of complexity when it comes to humans and disease. The second recommendation is that services could provide models of care that emphasize family, social networks, and communities rather than individuals or populations, focusing on these larger relational units that represent the kind of middle ground that they describe in extended health. So recovery sort of extends to partners, friends, children, and other people in the lives of people who use drugs. This is acknowledging the need for changes in social and personal identity. Framing recovery in this way would acknowledge the value that people who use drugs provide to those around them, whilst also requiring support themselves. Third, an extended recovery model would also acknowledge the chronic nature of something like drug-related harm, moving away from short-term strategies that necessitate abstinence. Abstinence-focused acute care programs are important and do help many people, but we need frameworks that allow for the values of different groups that can prioritize harm reduction over abstinence, which will be less likely to exacerbate stigma and more effective at reducing harm. And fourth, finally, an extended recovery model would also be based on a more diverse understanding of recovery trajectories, and that validates the forms of change, progress, and growth that people can experience without being absent from drugs. This is the subject of another one of the publications from this study. For a lot of participants, recovery extended outside of their periods of abstinence. It was something they were always working on. And by acknowledging this, we can further reduce stigma and empower people to find success through their own self-defined trajectories and goals. So in conclusion, Harmful drug use, some forms of harmful drug use can be viewed as a disease, but a disease occurring within an extended body that incorporates multiple social and environmental aspects, leading to an emergent effect of addiction. By emphasizing the ways we are all continuous with the people and the environment around us, and not drawing categorical lines between the behavior of people who use drugs and everyone else, an extended recovery model could be demarginalizing for people that experience drug-related harm. Posthumanist approaches that view health, disease, and agency as distributed and contingent can lead to a framework for intervention that is ultimately humanizing, by recognizing that the effective ways of reducing drug-related harm aren't focused on treating amoral or pathological individuals. Extended recovery is instead based on non-judgmental, non-moralizing, but assertive strategies that address the social and familial contexts in which individuals are embedded. This approach can thereby reduce the threat to people who use drugs of losing their humanity in the eyes of society or themselves, and relieve them of the challenge to become more human through narrow and predetermined trajectories of recovery. In her final interview, some months after the washing up tirade, Jane tearfully concluded that this is just a disease and something that I have to fight for every day. As long as I keep trying, hopefully one day I'll get it right. While Jane allocated herself sole responsibility for one day getting it right, in practice, her recovery trajectory was extended through her relationship with her partner and his drug use, through their children, clinicians, and others. By providing policies and models of care that recognize this, based on a post-humanist framework, we may be able to reassure Jane that, contrary to her original assertion, she had been human all along. Thank you. And to finish off, I'd like to acknowledge all of the participants that gave so much to this study, to my advisory team, including Lisa, and to the services that assisted with recruitment, and to the Queensland Injectors Health Network that also provided an advisory committee for this project, which is extremely valuable. And that's it. Thank you very much.